Ants don't respond to clean counters or sealed containers the way most people think. If you want an ant-free home, these 10 plants are the only thing that gets you there. Stay with me for number 9, the oldest written ant record in history. Number 4 is the one most people have never heard of, and it's the strongest on this list. 1. The plant that shuts down ant communication. You've wiped the counter, checked the cabinets, sealed the trash, and by the next morning there's a new trail running along the same baseboard as yesterday. The problem isn't cleanliness. Ants navigate by scent trails left behind by scouts, and peppermint produces menthol at a concentration that physically disrupts those pheromone signals, not just masks them. So the trail goes silent, and the ants behind the scout are left scrambling with no instruction to follow. Most people plant one small pot near the back door and wonder why it doesn't work. A single container isn't a barrier, it's a decoration. Mentha piperita needs to be planted in a continuous line along entry points, foundation edges and garden borders to create a scent threshold the colony won't cross. Fresh peppermint steeped in boiling water and cooled makes a spray that can be applied directly to ant trails, nest entrances and countertops, and it's completely safe to use around kids and pets. It doesn't poison the colony. It erases the map they were using to find you, and without that map, the scouts that follow have nothing to read and nowhere to go. There's a plant that worked for centuries before anyone understood why, and what it does to an insect on contact is nothing like what you just heard. 2. The weed your grandmother pulled that was doing the work. Tansy has been growing along fence lines and field edges for centuries, and for most of that time, farmers kept it around without fully understanding what it was doing. Medieval households bundled it and laid it across doorways and windowsills every summer, and the practice looked like superstition, right up until someone tested what thujone does to an insect's nervous system on contact. Thujone disrupts the signals, and ants' nervous system relies on to coordinate movement so the colony learns fast which boundaries carry that consequence. And tansy is one of the few plants where that lesson sticks for good. Tanacetum vulgar releases higher concentrations of thujone as temperatures climb, which means the barrier it creates gets stronger during the same weeks. Ant pressure peaks in most gardens. That live heat response is something no bottled product can match, because a spray has a fixed concentration from the moment it leaves the factory, while a living plant adjusts its output based on the conditions around it. The barrier that gets harder to cross in July is the one rooted in your soil, not the one sitting under your sink. The reason most people don't grow it is the same reason most useful plants disappear from yards. Someone decided it looked too wild, reclassified it as a weed, and pulled it out. Tansy is easy to find, easy to establish, and requires almost nothing from you once it's in the ground. What comes next doesn't repel ants. It makes your garden disappear from their map entirely. 3. The plant that makes your garden invisible to a colony. Most people who grow lavender cut it back in spring, tie a few bundles to dry, and stop there. Lavender produces a compound called linalool that wraps the space in a chemical fog, blocking the receptors ants use to map their surroundings. A garden edged with lavender doesn't register as dangerous to a colony, it registers as unreadable, and ants that cross into that zone stop laying trail markers entirely. A colony that senses danger will find a different route around the perimeter. A colony that can't read a space won't build trails through it at all, which means everything growing inside that border stays untouched without the ants ever making a direct attempt to enter. Planted alongside peppermint at entry points and tansy along borders, lavender fills the middle layer of a system where every zone the colony enters becomes harder to read than the last. The compound concentration in lavender responds to growing conditions, with stressed plants in lean soil producing more linalool than pampered ones, which means this plant delivers more pest protection, precisely when the garden around it needs it most. Keep watching, because what comes fourth on this list surprised the researchers who studied it, and it's been sitting in the discount bin at your local nursery the whole time. 4. The variety nobody buys and the one that actually works. Cinnamon basil. Ocimum basilicum cinnamomum produces a compound called eugenol at concentrations that common sweet basil doesn't come close to matching. Eugenol doesn't confuse ants or block their navigation like the plants before it on this list. It shuts down the recruitment signal entirely, which means a colony that finds your garden has no chemical way to call others in, and the scouts that do arrive leave without confirming anything. Ant recruitment turns 3 scouts into 300 foragers inside of an hour. Without the confirmation signal, those scouts wander the perimeter, circle back, and abandon the search. The infestation that never grows past a handful of ants isn't luck. It's a recruitment signal that never got sent. Cinnamon basil grows in full sun with the same basic care as any other basil variety, and it produces eugenol most heavily during its flowering stage, which most gardeners cut off to extend the harvest. Letting a few plants flower at garden borders costs nothing and keeps eugenol output at its peak through late summer when ant pressure is highest. There's a plant coming up that went head-to-head with one of the most widely used synthetic repellents in a university study, and the results were not close. 5. The backyard plant that beat DEET in a lab. A study out of Iowa State University found that nepetalactone, the active compound in catnip, repelled insects at a rate that matched or exceeded DEET in controlled conditions. That finding got attention for mosquitoes, but the ant data coming out of the same research is just as significant. Ants exposed to nepetalactone show immediate avoidance behavior, pulling back from treated surfaces within seconds and refusing to re-enter a treated area for hours after a single application. What separates catnip from every other plant covered so far is the speed of that response. Peppermint disrupts communication over time. Lavender blocks navigation gradually. Catnip, Nepeta cataria, produces a reaction in ants that is measurable within minutes, which makes it the plant you reach for when the problem is already in front of you, rather than something you're building a season-long barrier against. The ants don't reroute, they ghost the area entirely. Dried catnip placed inside cabinets, along baseboards and near entry points carries the same nepetalactone concentration as the living plant, which makes it the only entry on this list that works indoors without a pot, a window, or a watering schedule. 5 plants down, 5 more. And the ones left on this list are the reason ants treat certain yards like a hard boundary they won't cross. 6. The most potent plant on this list, and the one that comes with a warning. You can spend a season treating the same ant trail along your foundation with sprays that work for a day and come back the next week, watching the same trail rebuild in the same crack by Thursday, or you can plant something that makes the colony decide the ground itself isn't safe to nest near. Pennyroyal, Mentha pelagium, produces a compound called pulegone, and ant colonies that encounter it don't just change their route. They relocate their nest entrance away from the plant's root zone entirely. Pulegone works through direct toxicity, not navigation interference or scent thresholds like the plants before it, and ants that cross a pennyroyal border don't scramble and reroute the way they do with scent barriers. They stop. The concentration that makes it lethal to insects is the same concentration that makes it unsafe for pregnant women and small children at high exposure, so it belongs at the perimeter of a garden. Keep it well away from where pets graze or children sit in the grass. Planted along foundation lines and property borders, pennyroyal creates a boundary ant colony's treat as a hard stop rather than an obstacle to root around. It spreads aggressively in moist soil and needs containment to keep it from overtaking neighboring plants, but inside that boundary it requires nothing to keep working season after season. The ground itself is where the next plant does its work, and it operates on a system no upright plant on this list can reach. 7. The ground cover that works, while everything else sleeps. Every crack in your patio, every gap between pavers, every inch along your wall base is a corridor ants are actively mapping and using. Thymus citriodorus produces citronellal and thymol together, and that combination does something neither compound accomplishes on its own. Those two compounds don't just block new trails from forming, they dissolve the ones already written into the surface, which means the colony's entire map for that section of ground stops working at once. Ground level is where ant infrastructure lives. Scouts lay trails along soil surfaces, cracks in pavement, and the base of walls. And those trails are the operating system the entire colony runs on to move workers and food between the nest and a target. Lemon thyme planted densely along pathways, patio edges, and wall bases physically occupies the terrain those trails need to exist. And every plant that roots into a gap is one less corridor the colony can use. It spreads flat, roots as it goes, and fills spaces between pavers and along borders that taller plants leave exposed. A colony that loses its ground map in one section has to start the entire scouting process over, and by the time new scouts arrive, the time has rooted further. One plant on this list gets more lethal the harder the season gets, and it's probably sitting on your kitchen windowsill right now doing nothing. 8. The herb that gets deadlier in a drought. Rosemary has been used as a household insect deterrent across Mediterranean cultures for centuries, and the people using it had no way of knowing the plant in their kitchen window was chemically weaker than the one baking outside. Heat pulls camphor and borneol to the leaf surface at concentrations indoor rosemary never reaches, and an ant that walks across an outdoor plant in summer has its legs shut down mid-stride before it can make the return trip to the colony. Camphor doesn't reroute ants the way a scent barrier does. It shuts down their ability to walk. An ant that can't complete the return trip never reinforces the trail it was building, and the food source it found never gets reported back to the nest. That broken loop means the colony keeps sending scouts into a zone that keeps swallowing them, draining its workforce without a single confrontation. Rosemary planted along south-facing garden walls and patio borders gets maximum sun exposure, which drives the highest compound output. Pruning after flowering encourages dense new growth with higher essential oil content, and that new growth carries more camphor per leaf than older woody stems. A row of established rosemary along a garden border is a year-round barrier that gets stronger with every season it's in the ground. The civilization that first documented what comes next wasn't building a garden. They were trying to solve the same problem you have right now. 9. The plant with the oldest ant record in documented history. Ancient Egyptian households documented wormwood as an ant deterrent, and medieval European manuscripts record the same application more than 1,000 years later, with no connection between the two traditions. Artemisia absinthium solved the same problem on 2 continents before anyone had a word for the compounds making it work. That kind of independent agreement across unconnected civilizations is not a coincidence, it's a result. What those households couldn't measure was the underground reach of wormwood's chemistry. The plant produces 2 bitter compounds, absinthin and thujon, and unlike the surface-level action of camphor in rosemary, these leach into the soil around the root zone and accumulate there over seasons. Ant colonies avoid establishing nest sites within several feet of a mature wormwood plant, not because of anything happening above ground, but because the soil itself has become chemically hostile underneath them. That same hostility doesn't stop at ants. Sensitive herbs and vegetables planted too close will struggle or fail, so wormwood needs its own bed, or a border spot well away from the rest of the garden. Wormwood establishes in poor dry soil where most other plants on this list struggle to survive, which makes it the right choice for gravel borders, rocky slopes, and dry property edges where nothing else wants to grow. It reaches 3 feet tall and spreads slowly, so it holds a border position without the containment that pennyroyal and peppermint both require to stay manageable. The last plant on this list didn't start in a garden. It started in a laboratory, and the industry that tried to replace it never fully succeeded. 10. The flower the pesticide industry spent decades trying to bottle. Every homeowner who has ever reached for an ant spray with pyrethroid on the label was buying a copy of what pyrethrum daisies, Tanacetum cinerariifolium, make naturally. The natural compound breaks down within days in sunlight, which made it impossible to bottle and sell on a shelf, so chemists spent the better part of the 20th century engineering synthetic versions built to last longer. The living plant doesn't have that problem. It just keeps producing more, so the breakdown that made it useless to a company makes it perfect for a garden bed that's still there next season. The original is available for a few dollars at any garden center, and it's been sitting there the whole time. Pyrethrins get inside the ant's body on contact, shutting down leg coordination, then feeding, then navigation, in that order. The synthetic versions were engineered to last longer, but that persistence is what makes them toxic to beneficial insects, aquatic life, and soil organisms. The natural version breaks down within days of sun exposure and leaves nothing behind that damages the system around it. Tanacetum cinerariifolium grows in full sun, tolerates poor soil, and produces the highest pyrethrin concentration in its flowers just before full bloom. Harvesting flowers at that stage and drying them produces a powder that can be applied directly to ant trails, nest entrances, and garden borders. Nothing from this plant needs to go to waste before it's done every job it's capable of doing. If any part of this changed the way you see what's already available to you, subscribe, because there's an entire pest management system growing in gardens most people walk past every single day. Tell me in the comments which of these 10 you're planting first, and whether ants have been winning in your yard or your kitchen.